In World War II air combat, the pilot who waited the longest often survived, and the one who reacted first often died. That sounds wrong. It contradicts everything pilots were trained to believe. In the spring of 1944, one American fighter pilot proved it in a fight that should have ended in seconds. He was outnumbered 7-1. Low on fuel, his radio was dead, and a damaged bomber behind him could not escape. Every rule of air combat demanded immediate action. Turn, dive, run. He did none of it. From the German perspective, the situation looked finished. A silent pilot, no reaction, no escape. They believed time would force a mistake. What they did not understand was this. Silence was not hesitation, it was calculation. While the German fighters waited for panic, the American pilot was studying something far more dangerous than speed or firepower. He was watching how decisions spread inside a formation. Who committed first? Who followed? And when confidence quietly turned into assumption, when the attack finally began, the outcome was already decided. This story is not about heroism. It is about a hidden rule of war, one that rarely appears in textbooks, and how patience, used correctly, could break an enemy system without firing first. Want to understand how wars are really decided not by noise, but by systems? Stay with this story. 1944, air combat over Europe no longer resembled the chaotic dogfights of the early war. It had become a system. Every altitude, every fuel calculation, every interception route was mapped, measured, and refined. Nothing was random anymore. On one side, the Allied air forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe each week. Bomber streams crossed the continent in rigid formations, their paths predictable but relentless. On the other side, German fighter units adapted not through brute force, but through pattern recognition. They learned to wait. Instead of charging head-on, they studied escort behavior. They watched how long fighters stayed with bombers. They learned where fuel limits forced American pilots to turn back. And, most importantly, they identified the moment when discipline collapsed. Because in the air, collapse rarely came from firepower. It came from assumption. German fighter doctrine had settled on a quiet belief, rarely written down, rarely questioned, but widely trusted. If an enemy pilot was isolated, low on fuel, and cut off from communication, he would act. He would react fast. He would break formation. He would try to escape. And the moment he did, the system rewarded patience. The German fighters would not rush him. They would pace him, circle him. Let time do the work. Fuel drains faster under stress. Errors multiply under silence. Eventually, the enemy would reveal himself by turning too early, diving too steeply, or separating from what little protection remained. This method worked, not once or twice, but repeatedly. American loss reports confirmed it. Isolated escorts vanished. Stragglers never returned. Damaged bombers fell because the fighters meant to protect them could not afford to wait. From the German perspective, the equation was simple. Time plus pressure equals mistake. But systems fail when they stop questioning their assumptions. What the Luftwaffe did not fully account for was the existence of pilots who did not behave according to stress models. Pilots who did not treat silence as a threat. Pilots who did not associate waiting with indecision. Because discipline, when absolute, changes how time works. Most pilots experience time emotionally, seconds stretched under fear, moments blurred during attack. Decision-making accelerated because instinct demanded movement. But there were exceptions. A small number of pilots approached combat the way engineers approached machines. They did not experience chaos first. They experienced variables. Altitude was a number. Fuel was a number. Speed, distance, closure rate numbers. Even enemy behavior followed measurable patterns when observed long enough. For these pilots, waiting was not passive. It was active data collection. And this was where the German assumption became dangerous. Their doctrine assumed that silence meant degradation, that a quiet pilot was a pilot losing control of the situation. That inactivity signaled fear or confusion. In reality, silence could also mean processing. When two formations met in the air, both sides believed they were reading the other. But only one side understood which signals actually mattered. German pilots watched for movement. American Doctrine trained pilots to watch for threats. But one pilot in that sky was watching something else entirely. He was watching leadership. In German fighter formations, authority was not diffuse. Decisions did not emerge collectively. They flowed from a central figure. The lead aircraft set the geometry. When the leader committed, the formation followed. Once the leader turned aggressive, retreat became coordination failure. This structure was efficient until someone recognized it. The problem was not that German tactics were flawed. It was that they assumed their opponent would always respond within the same emotional framework. Fear, urgency, impulse. But not every pilot lived there. Some lived in calculation. When silence entered the cockpit, most pilots felt exposed, disconnected, alone. But a pilot trained to rely on numbers rather than reassurance experienced silence differently. It removed distraction. It eliminated noise. Without radio chatter, there was no panic to absorb from others. No urgency transmitted through tone. Only the aircraft, the enemy, and the math connecting them. This was the blind spot. German fighters believed they were controlling the timeline. They believed that by delaying engagement, they were forcing the American pilot closer to failure with every passing second. What they did not realize was that the delay worked both ways. Every second without engagement allowed observation. Every uncommitted maneuver revealed hierarchy. Every test movement exposed who waited and who would move first. The longer no one fired, the clearer the structure became. This is where the paradox begins. The tactic designed to provoke a mistake became the mechanism that revealed vulnerability. Waiting, which should have weakened the isolated pilot, strengthened his understanding of the system surrounding him. And when a system reveals itself, it becomes predictable. The German fighters believed the American pilot was running out of options. In reality, they were narrowing their own. They had committed to patience, without realizing they were also committing to sequence. Leader first, followers second, retreat last. Once that sequence existed, it could be disrupted, not by speed, not by firepower, but by timing, by allowing the system to advance just far enough to lock itself into motion. This was not heroism. It was not luck. It was not improvisation under fire. It was the exploitation of a belief so widely accepted that no one thought to defend against it. That belief was simple. That waiting was weakness. And in the minutes that followed, that belief would cost German pilots their formation, their control, and the fight itself. The encounter did not begin with gunfire. It began with stillness. High above occupied Europe, the American formation was already thinning. Bombers lumbered westward after the drop, some scarred, some struggling, all slower than planned. Escort fighters adjusted constantly, trading altitude for position, fuel for coverage. This was the most dangerous phase of the mission. Not the penetration, not the bomb run, the withdrawal. German fighter units understood this better than anyone. They rarely attacked when formations were tight and confident. They waited until exhaustion began to show. And on this day, the signs were perfect. One bomber lagged behind the stream, its engines uneven, its formation discipline broken by damage. Above it, a small group of American fighters stayed close, refusing to abandon it. Their movements were defensive, cautious, predictable. Then the radios failed. Whether from damage, interference, or simple mechanical failure no longer mattered. What mattered was what silence meant in the sky. Without radio contact, coordination slowed. Hand signals replaced speech. Situational awareness narrowed to what could be seen directly. For most pilots, this was the beginning of panic. Silence removed reassurance. It amplified isolation. It made time feel faster and decisions feel heavier. German fighters appeared shortly afterward, sliding into view from the north. Not diving, not climbing, matching altitude. 7 of them. They did not attack. They did not scatter. They simply took position. To the German pilots, this was ideal geometry. The Americans were boxed in by circumstance rather than firepower. Fuel was draining. Communication was gone. The bomber could not accelerate. The escorts could not leave without abandoning it. From experience, the Germans knew what usually came next. Someone would move too soon. A fighter would break formation to threaten. Another would peel away to cover. Angles would open. Discipline would fracture. That fracture was the moment they hunted. But something was wrong. The American fighters did not react. They did not close distance. They did not spread out. They did not signal retreat. They held position. From inside the German formation, this behavior felt unnatural. It violated expectation. The longer nothing happened, the more attention shifted from the bomber to the escorts themselves. Why were they not responding? Time passed. Fuel burned. Still no movement. The Germans adjusted slightly, testing. One aircraft edged forward, just enough to provoke a reaction. None came. Another shifted laterally, widening the formation. Still nothing. This should have triggered urgency among the Americans. Instead, it produced restraint. What the German pilots interpreted as hesitation was, in reality, discipline. Inside one American cockpit, silence was not a countdown. It was clarity. Without radio chatter, there was no emotional contamination, no frantic calls, no urgency imposed by tone. There was only observation. The pilot watched how the German aircraft positioned themselves. Who drifted ahead? Who lagged behind? Who waited for confirmation? He was not measuring speed alone. He was measuring intent. Every formation tells a story if given time, not in its weapons, but in its behavior. Some aircraft probed, some mirrored, some deferred. Hierarchy emerged. The lead German fighter did not rush. He controlled spacing. He tested reactions. When he moved, the others adjusted around him, not independently. That mattered. In formations like this, aggression was centralized. Commitment flowed downward. The American pilot recognized the pattern not because he had seen it once, but because he had seen variations of it repeatedly. In training, in earlier engagements, in after-action reports studied long after others stopped caring. He understood something most pilots never consciously processed. Formations do not collapse when they lose aircraft. They collapse when they lose certainty. As long as the German pilots believed they were controlling the timeline, they remained confident. As long as their leader had not committed, retreat remained an option. The American pilot did not want to provoke early aggression. He wanted commitment. That required patience. Seconds stretched. German perspective, the situation began to feel delayed. They were accustomed to forcing errors by waiting. Now, waiting itself felt unproductive. Fuel calculations ran quietly in their minds as well. They were not unlimited. They had flown out to intercept. They had maneuvered to position. Time was no longer a free resource. The lead German fighter shifted again. A little lower, a little faster. This was not yet an attack. It was a signal. The American pilot did not move. From the outside, this appeared reckless. A refusal to act in the face of mounting danger. But inside the cockpit, something else was happening. The pilot was aligning moments. He was watching for the instant when observation would become assumption, when confidence would quietly cross into commitment. The Germans believed silence would break the Americans. Instead, it began to work against them. The longer they delayed, the more structure they revealed. The more they revealed, the less flexible they became. Their patience had shape now. Sequence, predictability. Leader first, followers second. Once that sequence locked in, reversal became difficult. The American pilot did not need all seven to commit. He needed one. Specifically, the one everyone else watched. When the lead German fighter finally nosed forward, it was subtle, barely perceptible. But it was enough. Angles changed. Spacing tightened. The formation began to lean into attack geometry. This was the point of no return. Not because weapons had fired, but because intent had solidified. The system had made its decision. And systems, once in motion, are vulnerable at their point of commitment. The American pilot moved not in panic, not in reaction, but in response to something that had already happened. The Germans believed they were beginning the fight. In reality, they had already lost control of it. What followed would not be a test of reflexes or aggression. It would be a test of whether the system could survive the loss of its center. And in the next moments, silence would no longer belong to the Americans. The American pilot finally moved. It did not look dramatic. There was no sudden charge, no frantic evasive turn, no desperate attempt to escape. From the outside, it was almost disappointing. But this was the most dangerous moment of the encounter, not because of violence, but because of precision. The German formation had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer observing. They were committing. In air combat, commitment is not the same as aggression. Aggression can be reversed. Commitment cannot. Once a formation begins to execute an attack geometry, it sacrifices flexibility for coordination. Angles are chosen. Speeds are aligned. Roles are assumed. Most pilots instinctively target the nearest threat. The closest aircraft feels like the most urgent danger. Doctrine reinforces this instinct. But doctrine also creates predictability. The American pilot did not aim for proximity. He aimed for influence. He understood that formations do not function as collections of individuals. They function as decision trees. At the top of that tree sat the leader. When the leader commits, the rest follow, not because they want to, but because cohesion demands it. Break formation at that moment, and the system fractures. Stay committed, and survival depends on the leader's judgment. The American pilot had waited precisely for this point. Not when the Germans appeared. Not when they tested. Not even when they edged forward. He waited until the leader committed in a way that could not be undone without chaos. Only then did he act. The maneuver was not aggressive, it was anticipatory. Instead of reacting to where the Germans were, he moved to where the leader had to be. This distinction mattered. Reaction places you behind the timeline. Anticipation places you inside it. The American fighter rolled, inverted, and dropped into a dive not toward the center of the formation, but toward the node that held it together. The speed increase was immediate. Gravity did the work. Altitude converted into velocity. The German leader saw him coming late, not because he was inattentive, but because he was already committed elsewhere. His focus was forward. His role was execution. That was the trap. The American pilot did not fire immediately. He closed distance. He aligned geometry. Every variable had already been calculated during the waiting. Closure rate, angle, deflection. When he fired, it was brief, controlled, enough. The leader's aircraft broke apart under the impact, not spectacularly, not explosively, but decisively. The effect on the formation was immediate. Without the leader, coordination dissolved. The remaining German fighters were now individuals mid-commitment, executing roles that no longer made sense. Some were too fast. Some were too slow. Some found themselves covering positions that no longer existed. This was not confusion born of fear. It was confusion born of structure collapse. The American pilot did not chase. He did not linger. He reversed his dive and climbed back into the space the formation had just vacated. This mattered more than the kill itself. By reappearing at escort altitude, he signaled something the Germans could not ignore. The system was still there, intact, watching. 2 German fighters attempted to re-engage, but the moment had passed. Their fuel state was now critical. Their timing was off. Their confidence had evaporated. They hesitated. That hesitation was fatal to momentum. The remaining aircraft disengaged not because they were beaten, but because the cost of continuing had become uncertain. This is the part most after-action reports fail to capture. The fight did not end because the Americans destroyed all opposition. It ended because the German formation lost its ability to decide. Decision-making is the true currency of combat. Once it is disrupted, firepower becomes irrelevant. The American pilot understood this. He did not pursue. He did not press for additional victories. His objective was not dominance. It was protection. The bomber survived, and that outcome mattered more than any tally. From the German perspective, the encounter was baffling. They had done everything correctly. They had waited. They had controlled distance. They had forced commitment. Yet they had lost. Because their tactics were inferior, but because their assumption had been exposed. They believed patience belonged to them. They believed silence favored the hunter. They did not consider that patience could be weaponized by the hunted. The American pilot never saw himself as outnumbered. He saw 7 variables arranged around a single decision point. Once that point was identified, the rest followed naturally. This is where the story shifts from incident to insight. What happened in that sky was not unique because of who the pilot was. It was unique because of how he thought. He did not attempt to overpower the system. He allowed it to reveal itself. He did not disrupt it early. He let it commit fully. And only then did he intervene at the moment when reversal was no longer possible. This was not instinct. It was design. The Germans believed the fight was decided by speed and aggression. The American pilot proved it was decided earlier by patience and perception. In the seconds after the leader fell, the formation collapsed inward, not violently, quietly, and that quiet collapse carried a lesson that would outlive the aircraft involved. A system that relies on assumption becomes fragile the moment someone refuses to behave as expected. The American pilot did not win by doing more. He won by doing less until the exact moment doing something mattered. What followed would transform this single encounter into doctrine. But that understanding would not come immediately. First, the system had to be studied. The fight did not end with the loss of the German leader. That was only the visible moment. What truly ended was control. In air combat, control is not measured by altitude or position. It is measured by who dictates the next decision. Before the engagement, the German formation controlled time. They chose when to approach, when to test, when to commit. After the leader fell, that control vanished. The remaining German pilots were still armed, still flying, still capable of fighting. But capability is not the same as coordination. Each pilot now faced a private calculation: fuel, distance, escape routes. Without a central decision-maker, those calculations no longer aligned. This is the invisible damage most combat narratives overlook. Aircraft are machines. Formations are systems. And systems fail long before the last component breaks. The American pilot understood this intuitively. That was why he did not pursue aggressively. Why he resisted the temptation to press advantage. Aggression would have scattered the Germans further, but scattering was already happening. What mattered now was preservation. He climbed back to escort altitude and rejoined the bomber. This decision revealed his true objective. Not victory, survival. The bomber remained intact. Its crew remained alive. And that outcome mattered more than the destruction of enemy aircraft. From a tactical perspective, this was unusual. Many pilots chased kills. They were rewarded for it, promoted for it. But chasing kills often meant abandoning the mission. The American pilot did not confuse achievement with purpose. That distinction mattered deeply to planners watching from the ground. When intelligence officers later reconstructed the encounter, they noticed something striking. The German fighters did not disengage because they were overwhelmed. They disengaged because they could no longer predict outcomes. Uncertainty is lethal in combat. Once a formation loses confidence in its own assumptions, even superior firepower becomes irrelevant. This is why the encounter resonated far beyond a single mission. It exposed a flaw not in German aircraft or training, but in belief. German doctrine assumed that patience always favored the hunter. That time would force mistakes. What this encounter demonstrated was that patience is neutral. It benefits whoever understands how to use it. Waiting without observation is stagnation. Waiting with analysis is preparation. The American pilot did not outwait the Germans. He out-observed them. That difference changed everything. As reports circulated, analysts began to notice patterns. Engagements where German formations failed often shared similar traits: extended pacing, delayed commitment, centralized leadership. When those conditions existed, formations were vulnerable not to speed, but to disruption. This insight challenged existing assumptions on both sides. For the Allies, it reframed escort doctrine. Pilots were taught that survival was not just about reaction speed, but about restraint. That silence could be managed rather than feared. That waiting did not always mean losing initiative. For the Germans, the lesson was harder to absorb. Their tactics had worked too well for too long. Success had reinforced belief, and belief, once validated repeatedly, becomes invisible. No one questions what works until it doesn't. This encounter forced a quiet recalibration. German pilots became more cautious about extended pacing, more wary of over-centralized decision-making. But caution introduced its own problems. Hesitation slowed response times. Flexibility decreased. The very discipline that once gave advantage now introduced doubt. The system could not simply revert to aggression without sacrificing efficiency, nor could it decentralize leadership without losing cohesion. This is the cost of systemic exposure. Once a vulnerability is revealed, adaptation is never simple. For the American side, the lessons spread gradually. Not every pilot could replicate the method. It required discipline few possessed. Waiting under pressure is harder than attacking. Resisting instinct demands confidence grounded in understanding. But those who did learn benefited. Escort formations became tighter. Communication protocols evolved. Pilots were encouraged to observe before engaging. This did not eliminate losses. It could, but it reduced unnecessary ones. The encounter demonstrated something planners had long suspected but rarely articulated: that wars are not decided solely by hardware, or numbers, or bravery. They are decided by how well each side understands the systems they operate within. The American pilot did not defeat 7 aircraft. He defeated a process. He allowed the German formation to follow its own logic until that logic became predictable. Then he intervened at the exact moment when reversal was impossible. This is the difference between tactics and strategy. Tactics win moments. Strategy shapes behavior. What made this encounter enduring was not the kill count. It was the lesson. A lesson that could be taught, studied, and applied. That patience, when disciplined, creates leverage. That silence, when intentional, reveals structure. That control is lost, not when aircraft fall, but when decisions fragment. In the months that followed, this understanding quietly influenced how air combat was approached. Not through dramatic revisions, but through subtle shifts in thinking. Pilots were encouraged to ask different questions. Not how do I attack first? Well of log, Argras. But when does the enemy commit? Is live. Not how do I force a reaction? And Oliver's no, but what assumptions is the enemy making about me? We have to lie down. These questions changed behavior, and behavior changes outcomes. The American pilot returned from the mission with no speeches to give, no dramatic claims. His report was brief, precise, unemotional, but embedded within it was a principle that outlived the aircraft involved, that the most decisive moments in combat often occur before the first shot is fired, and that once control is lost, recovery is rarely possible. The German formation never regained it that day, and the sky, briefly, belonged to patience. What happened in that engagement did not remain isolated in the sky. Wars do not change because of single moments. They change when moments are understood, recorded, and repeated. The American pilot landed with barely enough fuel to taxi clear of the runway. There was no celebration waiting, no dramatic debrief. He filed his report the way he always did: brief, precise, technical. He described positions, timing, angles, fuel states. He described when the German leader committed, and he described why that moment mattered more than the number of aircraft involved. At first, the report blended in with hundreds of others. Air war paperwork was endless. Losses, claims, weather, maintenance. But intelligence officers noticed something unusual. The geometry did not match standard doctrine. The engagement timeline was inverted. Instead of reacting to the first threat, the pilot had delayed deliberately. Instead of engaging the nearest target, he had ignored it. Instead of pursuing advantage, he had disengaged early. On paper, this looked inefficient. In reality, it was the opposite. When analysts compared the encounter with similar missions, a pattern began to emerge. Formations escorted by pilots who practiced restraint lost fewer bombers. They did not score more kills. They survived more often. This forced a difficult question. What if aggression was not the primary variable? For years, air combat training emphasized decisiveness, quick reactions, immediate pressure. Those principles were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They assumed that the enemy always benefited from delay. That waiting favored the attacker. The encounter challenged that assumption. It suggested that delay could also favor the defender if the defender used time to understand rather than to endure. This was not easy to teach. Most pilots relied on instinct. Instinct demanded motion. It punished hesitation. The method demonstrated in that engagement required something else: confidence in calculation, trust in discipline, and the ability to resist emotional escalation. Not every pilot could do this. Not every pilot should. But the concept mattered. Within weeks, the encounter appeared in briefings not as a heroic story, but as a case study. Instructors reframed the lesson carefully. They did not tell pilots to wait blindly. They told them to observe deliberately. They did not discourage aggression. They emphasized timing. The message was subtle. Do not be the first to move unless you understand what movement will trigger. Do not mistake silence for weakness either in yourself or in the enemy. And most importantly, identify who controls decision-making in the opposing formation. This marked a shift. Escort pilots began to think less about individual opponents and more about structure. Who leads? Who follows? When commitment becomes irreversible. These were not revolutionary ideas. They had existed in fragments. What changed was coherence. The encounter provided a clean example of how these fragments fit together. It demonstrated that systems reveal themselves under patience, and that once revealed, they can be disrupted with minimal force. German analysts, on their side, faced a different problem. They could see the loss. They could see the outcome. But understanding why was harder. Their doctrine had not failed spectacularly. It had failed quietly. There was no obvious mistake to correct, no single maneuver to forbid. The vulnerability lay in assumption, and assumptions are difficult to confront, especially when they have produced success. German pilots still believed patience was their advantage, but now they also suspected it could be exploited. This created hesitation. Hesitation changed engagement tempo. Tempo changed outcomes. Attempts to decentralize leadership introduced coordination issues. Attempts to tighten control reduced flexibility. The system began to strain under its own adjustments. For the Allies, the impact was cumulative rather than immediate. No single encounter turned the tide of the air war, but thousands of small decisions did. Each bomber that returned intact preserved experience. Each crew that survived increased institutional knowledge. The American pilot's method did not win the war by itself, but it contributed to a broader shift, a shift away from reflexive aggression. Informed restraint. Over time, this reduced unnecessary losses. That reduction mattered. Air wars are wars of attrition. They are decided by who can sustain operations longer. Survival is strategic. This is where the story transcends individual aircraft and formations. It becomes about how organizations learn. Most systems reward speed. Few reward patience. Yet the encounter demonstrated that patience, when structured, could outperform speed, not by slowing action, but by choosing when action mattered. This lesson echoed beyond the cockpit. It applied to planning rooms, to logistics, to command decisions. When leaders understood that not every threat required immediate response, resources were allocated more intelligently. When pilots understood that silence could be managed, panic decreased. These effects compounded. The quiet method became invisible precisely because it worked. There were no dramatic victories to celebrate, no slogans to repeat, just fewer losses. And fewer losses change wars. The American pilot never framed his actions as innovative. He did not see himself as changing doctrine. He believed he was doing what the situation demanded. But history is shaped less by intention than by consequence. His approach revealed a truth that had always existed but rarely been acknowledged. That control in combat is not seized by speed alone. It is seized by understanding. That reacting first is not always acting best. And that patience, when disciplined, is not passive. It is strategic. As the air war continued, this understanding spread not loudly, not uniformly, but persistently. And by the time the war ended, the lesson had embedded itself quietly into how air combat was thought about. Not as a rule, but as a principle, that the most dangerous pilot is not the fastest, nor the most aggressive. It is the one who knows when not to move. After the aircraft involved were scrapped, the lesson remained. Wars are often remembered through images of motion, explosions, charges, rapid decisions made under fire. But beneath that visible chaos exists a quieter war, one fought inside systems, assumptions, and beliefs. The encounter that began with silence revealed something uncomfortable. That much of what decides survival happens before action begins. The American pilot did not win because he was faster. He did not win because he was braver. He won because he understood where decisions were truly made. This distinction matters. Most people imagine combat as a contest of reactions. Who moves first? Who strikes harder? But in reality, combat is a contest of interpretation. Who understands the situation more accurately? Who sees structure where others see noise? Who recognizes commitment before it becomes irreversible? The German pilots believed they were controlling the engagement because they controlled movement. They believed patience favored them because it had in the past. They were wrong not because patience failed, but because they misunderstood its nature. Patience is not a tactic. It is a condition. It benefits whoever uses time to extract meaning. The American pilot used time differently. While others experienced waiting as exposure, he experienced it as access. Access to patterns. Access to hierarchy. Access to intention. He was not waiting for an opportunity to act. He was waiting for the system to reveal itself. Once revealed, intervention required little effort. This is the quiet truth that made the encounter significant. The decisive moment was not the attack. It was the moment when the enemy believed the rules still applied. Systems are most vulnerable when they feel secure. When assumptions go unchallenged. When success reinforces belief. The German formation operated under a belief that had worked repeatedly. That silence meant pressure. That pressure produced mistakes. What they did not anticipate was an opponent who did not process pressure emotionally. An opponent who processed it analytically. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Emotional systems collapse under stress. Analytical systems sharpen. The American pilot was not immune to fear. He was trained to manage it. He did not suppress instinct. He subordinated it. That discipline allowed him to operate one layer deeper than his opponent, not at the level of maneuver, but at the level of decision-making. This is why the lesson extends beyond air combat. Every complex system, military, political, economic, relies on assumptions about behavior, assumptions about reaction, assumptions about fear, assumptions about urgency. When those assumptions are violated, systems misfire. They overcommit. They reveal structure. They lose flexibility. The encounter demonstrated that victory often belongs to the party that refuses to behave as expected. Not through randomness, but through understanding. The American pilot did not surprise the enemy with an unexpected maneuver. He surprised them by not moving at all. That restraint forced the system to expose its logic. And once logic is visible, it can be exploited. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. That restraint can be more disruptive than aggression. That silence can be louder than action. That patience, when disciplined, can collapse an enemy faster than speed. The legacy of this lesson is difficult to measure because it does not announce itself. There are no monuments to restraint, no medals for waiting, yet its impact was real. Fewer bombers lost, fewer crews killed, more experience carried forward. These outcomes compound. Wars are not decided by moments alone. They are decided by accumulation, by which side preserves capability longer, by which side learns faster. The American pilot contributed to that learning not through speeches or doctrine papers, but through example. His reports were unemotional, his language precise. He did not claim insight. He described observation, and that made the lesson transferable. Others could study it, replicate parts of it, adapt it to their own circumstances. This is how quiet ideas spread, not through declaration, through demonstration. By the end of the war, the skies had changed. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced guns. Replaced eyesight. Yet the underlying principle remained. That systems still commit. That leaders still matter. That timing still decides outcomes. Technology accelerated action, but it did not eliminate decision points. Someone still had to move first. Someone still had to commit. And someone still had the option to wait. The story endures because it challenges a comfortable myth. That courage is loud. That mastery is aggressive. That hesitation is weakness. In reality, the most dangerous individuals are often the quietest. They observe longer. They decide later. And when they act, they do so at a point where resistance is no longer possible. This is not a romantic idea. It is an uncomfortable one, because it implies that many failures are not caused by lack of effort, but by acting too soon. That impatience masquerades as decisiveness, And that speed, without understanding, accelerates collapse. The American pilot did not change the war by fighting harder. He changed it by thinking differently, by recognizing that the true battlefield was not the sky around him, but the assumptions inside his opponent's mind. That is where the war beneath the war is fought. And that is why this story matters. Not because of how many aircraft fell, but because of how a system failed when faced with someone who refused to play by its expectations. In the end, the quiet pilot did not defeat 7 fighters. He defeated certainty, and once certainty is gone, even the strongest systems begin to unravel. The story changed how you think about war, patience, or decision-making. Consider subscribing. More stories like this are coming, the ones history rarely explains.